This book came out of a series of writings that Arendt wrote between 1970 and 1975, the last 5 years of her life. Famously, when she died, the title page to what would be the third volume of The Life of the Mind on judging, was in her typewriter, and all she had written was the title page and the epigraph, and then she died. So the book was never finished. The thinking section, which is what we're going to read, was the one that was most closely finished. She had given that material in a number of lecture courses between 70 and 75, the Gifford lectures in 73, a lecture course at the New School in 74, and the Atherton lectures at Harvard University in 1975. And so this is sort of just the background for what is a somewhat contested manuscript that we currently have of the book. There's really no telling how much she would have edited it and changed it if, of course, she had lived to finish the book. So we have to go with what we have. The section on thinking, there's three sections of what was the proposed book: thinking, willing, and judging. And these were to be the three activities of the mind, the life of the mind. Judging was going to be, and we're going to get a hint of what judging is as we read through some of these sections on thinking, and we'll talk a lot about it. And it was going to be the culmination, really, of what the life of the mind was about, but it includes all three: judging, thinking, and willing. We're going to focus on thinking in our reading in this course, although, of course, willing and judging will come up. Great. A number of epigraphs are appended to the book. At the beginning of the whole book are two, one by Cato, attributed to Cato by Cicero on the Republic, and the other from Plato's Statesman. We'll get to those quickly. There's another epigraph before the section on thinking, which comes from Martin Heidegger. It's from Martin Heidegger's essay Was heißt denken, or what is thinking, or what is called thinking. And he writes, thinking does not bring knowledge as do the sciences. Thinking does not produce usable practical wisdom. Thinking does not solve the riddles of the universe. Thinking does not endow us directly with the power to act. Heidegger spent much of his life thinking about thinking. What is it to think? For him, as for Arendt, one of the essential activities that defines what it means to be human is to think. But Arendt and Heidegger are going to have a very different understanding of what thinking is in the end. What they agree on, before what they disagree on, is that thinking does not do these things. It does not give knowledge, does not lead to results, it does not solve anything, it does not tell us what to do and help us to act. And so, in many ways, the question of this book, and the question that we're going to be exploring with Hannah Arendt over the next few months as we read this book together, is what is this activity of thinking itself, which has so little that it does? Why is it important, if it is important, and does it do anything? It doesn't do all these things, we're told by Heidegger, and I think all these things Arendt would agree with. What does it do, and why is it important? Today we are reading the introduction to the book, as well as the first two short sections. So the book thinking itself, so there's the book, The Life of the Mind, and then within The Life of the Mind there's volume 1 on thinking. and that itself is split into four parts, right? Appearance, mental activities in a world of appearances, what makes us think, and where are we when we think. These are the questions of thinking that Hannah Arendt will ask. It's shocking, it's interesting, it's important that Arendt begins with appearance, and we're going to get to why. But that is going to be a key beginning to understanding. That is going to be what we're going to try and start to do today. We're going to finish the section on appearance next session, but today that's what we want to do. All right. I don't want to keep talking for too long, although I do want to get us through it. So I want to start by raising a question that comes from Bob Meyerson, and it relates to the first paragraph of the introduction. And I thought maybe we'd have a short discussion about that, and then I'll go on. But Bob writes, so in this first paragraph, Arendt makes a rhetorical move, we might say. I'll leave it to you. Maybe we have an argument whether it's rhetorical or not. In which she says, to give these lectures on the life of the mind requires justification. No justification for the topic is necessary. It's, life of the mind is an important thing to talk about. But why I should be one to do it, because I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a professional thinker. This is a claim she makes often, famously in the interview with Gauss, in which she says, he says, well, you're a famous philosopher. She goes, I have to correct you. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a political thinker. I'm a political theorist. And Bob writes, was anyone else put off by Arendt's remark? I have neither claim nor ambition to be a philosopher. This seems like a needless put down to me, an argument which we are to take ex cathedral from someone who regards herself as better than professional philosophers. Is this a slam against academic philosophy, against the predominance of analytic philosophy in her time, against the institutionalization of the teaching of philosophy, or just a trope for the purpose of her turning a new page in what was regarded as being the proper study of questions not answerable empirically? So is this a rhetorical question, Bob asks, or is there something to it? And I think there's something to it. On the obvious level, she's simply saying, look, I'm not a philosopher. I'm not trained in philosophy. I've never written a book of philosophy before. And, I write about politics. I don't write about philosophy. But there's a deeper question, which is that in all of her work, up until now, and until now also, but we're going to have to ask in an interesting way why, in all of her work, Arendt has asked about the world. She has asked about the world as it is. So in The Origins of Totalitarianism, she's asking, what is this thing called totalitarianism that happened, this event in the human condition? She's interested in what are the faculties of the way humans act in the world and labor, the way we are human. She's interested in the world, not the ideas. And she sees that as a non-philosophical approach. So if you believe Heidegger, her teacher, the entire history of philosophy is the history of being. He calls it die Seinsfrage, die Frage des Seins. And there's two parts of the question of being. One is, philosophers ask, what is this piece of paper as a piece of paper? What is this being as a being? And the other is, what is being? What does it mean to be? And this is what philosophers have asked since Plato. It's the question of, well, what is the table, but what is the being of a table? What is the truth of a table? What is the being of a cat? And philosophers since Plato have largely had certain answers to this. Some says that what makes a cat is the idea of a cat, and they're idealist philosophers, and that all cats partake in this idea, but they're not ever pure cats because the pure idea is a priori, is not empirical, and no real cat can ever live up to the truth of a cat. And then there are realists who say, no, forget the ideas, the cat is a cat. And what Arendt is going to argue here is that philosophers on either side have assumed this distinction between the ideal and the real, and that you almost can't be a philosopher if you don't approach this from a kind of metaphysical question, and that's how philosophers have thought. She's going to contest that distinction. Now, she's not the first one to do that. Many philosophers have done so. Certainly, every major philosopher in the continental tradition, since Kant, has at least begun to question it, and since Nietzsche has really said that this distinction is problematic. But and as a result, thinkers like Heidegger and also claimed not to be a philosopher, and Arendt is going to claim not to be a philosopher. So I think that there's more than there's a biographical claim, but there's also a claim, and let me say, there's also, Bob raises the question of, is she insulting philosophers? Insulting is not a word I would use, but there's no doubt that she thinks that to the extent one today, in the 20th century, certainly in the 21st century, concerns themselves with concepts and ideas as the core of what they're interested in, they are blind, in her mind, to the fact that this approach to thinking about the world through ideas, through metaphysics, has been lost, is dead, is filled with fallacies. And she thinks that you can do it as long as you're aware of the fact that it is no longer something you can do in earnest. You can understand how it happened, and there's a lot of, and the whole second part of the book, Unwilling, is going to be taking us on a course through this philosophy. You have to try and understand it, but it itself is a dead discipline. And even positivism, which might be thought of as the rejection of it, is still caught up in this distinction between the true and the apparent, or the true and the real. And so she's announcing here that she is not a philosopher. She's not a metaphysician. I want to at least make sure we get a little bit further. And so I want to turn us to are the page numbers I'm using, are they good? Yeah. So on pages 10 and 11 forward, she says at the top of page 10, I do not think that this return to metaphysics is likely or desirable. Right? I'm not a metaphysician. I don't think we're going to return metaphysics. The separation between the ideal and the real world and the ideal world, is not going to come to be healed. We have to, in a sense, reconcile ourselves to this separation. And what is dead for us is this distinction between truth and appearance. There's a very famous passage in Nietzsche in The Twilight of the Idols, and a little one-page part called "How the Real World Became a Fable," in which she quotes the penultimate line from it, which goes, "We have abolished the true world. What has remained? The apparent one, perhaps? Oh no! With the true world, we have abolished the apparent one. Once you give up on the true world, metaphysics, well, the whole premise of the true world was that it was the truth of the apparent world. Well, if you abolish the metaphysical world, there's no apparent world that can be apparent over and against the true one. And so it's this loss of that framework that she is here talking about. And then on the bottom of page 11, let's just read this paragraph at the bottom. She says, these modern deaths of God, metaphysics, philosophy, and by implication, positivism. So all these things die with the death of metaphysics, with this distinction between true and real. These modern deaths have become events of considerable historical consequence, since with the beginning of our century, they have ceased to be the exclusive concern of an intellectual elite, and instead are not so much the concern as the common unexamined assumption of nearly everybody. So it used to be that the intellectual elite worried about metaphysics. But now everybody is aware that truth doesn't exist. Everybody is aware that there's this kind of nihilistic tendency that if both worlds are dead, if there's no truth, we can pretty much do anything. And that there are no truths, therefore we can destroy what we have. That's a kind of fundamental nihilism. This has become a deep mother's milk, if I can say that, a deep sense of what we all imbibe as part of our culture. And she says, this is the political aspect. She goes, with this political aspect of the matter, we are not concerned in this book here. In our context, in this book, The Life of the Mind, it may even be better to leave the issue, which is one of political authority, outside of our considerations. Leave it aside. And instead, I'm adding that, but to insist rather on the simple fact that however seriously our ways of thinking may be involved in this crisis, our ability to think is not at stake. We are what men always have been, thinking beings. By this I mean no more that men and women and all persons have an inclination, perhaps a need, to think beyond the limitations of knowledge, to do more with this ability than use it as an instrument for knowing and doing. So this is what this book is about. It's not about the political dangers of the loss of metaphysics. It's about, even amidst the dangers and even amidst the loss of metaphysics, there is still this fact, this simple fact, that we all can still think. All of us can still think. And that in thinking, and then this is the question, what is thinking? In thinking, we don't seek knowledge, we don't seek, go back to Heidegger's quote that opened this section, we don't seek knowledge as do the sciences, we don't seek to produce usable practical wisdom, we don't solve riddles of the universe, we don't endow us directly with the power to act. Well, what do? Well, what she says is, we think. What does that mean? We have an inclination to think beyond knowledge. What is that? It's to think. He now goes into a distinction Kant makes between Vernunft and Verstand, between Vernunft, which is usually translated as reason, and Verstand, which she says is mistranslated as understanding. We're going to follow her just for a moment here. You could raise questions about it. But what it really means, Verstand, is to calculate or to rationalize. And what she says is, Verstand, what is typically thought of as understanding, calculating, logical reasoning, seeks to know useful things, seeks knowledge, seeks practice, seeks practical wisdom, wants to solve the riddles of the universe. But Vernunft is not inspired by the quest for truth, but she says by the quest for meaning. It's not inspired by the need to know, but to think. Not for truth, but for meaning. And this is how the introduction ends. What does it mean to think? It means to press beyond knowledge to a kind of meaningfulness. And that leads into part 1 of the book on appearance. Why? Why does this introduction that we need to learn to think, which is to pursue meaning, not knowledge, lead to appearance? And her answer is, well, let's just look at it. Page 19. The world men are born into contains many things, natural and artificial, living and dead, transient and sempiternal, all of which have in common that they appear and hence are meant to be seen, heard, touched, tasted, smelled, to be perceived by sentient creatures endowed with the appropriate sense organs. Nothing could appear. The word appearance would make no sense if recipients of appearances did not exist. Living creatures able to acknowledge, recognize, and react to, in flight or desire, approval, disapproval, blame, or praise, what is not merely there, but what appears to them. In this world which we enter, appearing from a nowhere and from which we disappear into a nowhere, being and appearing coincide. Dead matter, natural and artificial, changing and unchanging, depends in its being, that is, in its appearingness, on the presence of living creatures. In other words, nothing that is, insofar as it appears, exists in the singular. Here we get to the key. Everything that is meant to be perceived by somebody, not man, but men inhabit this planet. Plurality is the law of the earth. So once again, we see plurality, one of the absolutely central themes of Arendt's work, announced at the beginning of this book, in the first chapter of the first, book, part of the book after the introduction. Well, what's the connection between plurality and meaning? Well, it's very clear. In a world of plurality, there aren't truths. There are differences. There are opinions. There's different appearances. And if you believe, as Arendt does, that the world is a plural world, thinking cannot mean the seeking of knowledge, truth. It cannot mean an intellectual endeavor that seeks one answer. It has to be a thoughtful pursuit of meaning and opinion and the multiplicity of appearance that somehow is made meaningful despite and in spite of its plural uniquenesses and differences. And that is the reason that we're moving this idea of thinking away from the scientific truth pursuit to the pursuit of meaning.